to carry on. So let us pray. God Almighty in heaven, we are very grateful once more for this opportunity that you've given us and for the Sabbath that we've rested in your presence. We pray, oh God, now that even as we get to learn about some of what our pioneers did and we get to learn about even what's going on in our country right now, we pray, oh God, that as Christians, you'll be able to give us, oh God, the grace. You'll be able to help us so that in the things that we do, others will see you and be able to draw closer unto you. Bless our time now and bless our conversation. This was in your name. Amen.
Amen. Yeah, so our speaker today is Kevin Burton. I know Kevin, he was the best man at my wedding. His wife was actually the matron of honor at our wedding. So yeah, both he like our families go back together. We met at Andrews. Kevin is a historian by trade. He has studied at Adventist schools. He's studied religious history at non-Adventist schools. Kevin and I have both served as missionaries overseas. And one of the things that I really, really appreciate about Kevin is just the depth of knowledge that he has and just a huge array of Adventist topics. Whenever I hear Kevin speak, whether it's in a public setting like this or in a private setting, I just get a really new and fresh perspective that informs kind of the way that things are today. None of us kind of come to church and the church doesn't exist in a nicely packed vacuum. Sometimes when we look at, a set of fundamental beliefs or a prophecy seminar, we sometimes say, oh, okay, so all these prophecies of Revelation or these doctrines fit into this nice little box. But when I talk to Kevin, he a lot of times will add a lot of context that really links a lot of Adventist theology, a lot of Adventist culture, if you will, and ties it in with what was happening in the world and helps make sense of it all. So I always appreciate hearing Kevin talk about these issues, and I'm sure you will as well.
Oh, thank you. I guess it's my time, right?
Yeah.
Christian? Okay. Yeah. Let me ask this question because I'm going to present some and then we're going to discuss things too, right? We're doing both, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, good. So should I allow myself about half an hour for a presentation on material or what is your...
Yeah, about 30
minutes. Okay. I can easily go a lot longer. So I'll have to probably not do everything that I have here, but like there's no way I could do everything anyways. But I'm going to share my screen so that I can show you guys my PowerPoint. And hopefully, do you see it there?
Yes.
Okay, good. So I have been presenting on this topic in various forms and on forums for the last few days. And so some of this will be similar, but some of it is new. A lot of what I have for you guys is stuff I haven't actually shared with other people yet, even though I've been talking about it a bit. And so I want to talk about this topic here. Adventist pioneers and systemic racism. And I want to talk about how our pioneers actually dealt with this issue. And so here's the main point. Our Adventist pioneers strongly protested against systemic racism in America. This cannot be overstated, in fact. It was consistently clear among our pioneers in a variety of forms and fashions that they spoke out in strong protest and other kinds of protests as well. And I'm going to share with you some of the ways that happened. So we're talking about abolitionism, and this is the subject of my dissertation research. I'm analyzing and looking at Millerite and Seventh-day Adventist involvement in the abolition movement. And just in case you don't know, a lot of people get it confused with things like colonization. Colonization was this plan where a lot of white people, most evangelical Christians, in fact, they wanted to ship African-American people to Africa or some other place, but most commonly Africa, and basically make America white. That was not an abolitionist agenda. And so when I'm talking about abolitionism, I'm not talking about something like that. And some people do call that anti-slavery, although I think that's a misnomer. Adventists believe that you could not support colonization and be a good Seventh-day Adventist, okay? And so what they're advocating is what we call abolitionism, and that means two things. They're demanding the immediate and total abolition of the slaves in the South, and they're also demanding the equal rights for all Black Americans, North and South, okay? And Adventists, of course, are just part of a larger abolitionist movement. And it's important to know that this is a tiny, tiny minority of the North. Only about 2% of the North were abolitionists. And that's at the height of the movement. Only about 2%. Almost all evangelicals are not abolitionists, and many of them are anti-abolitionists. They're very, very hateful and will protest in violent riots against abolitionists. In fact, many Millerites were assaulted. George Storrs, for example, this is a little bit before the Millerite movement, but he was physically assaulted in a mob and almost killed. And he wasn't alone. And so I want that to be clear. Whenever we're talking about Millerism and Seventh-day Adventism, Adventists were not part of the evangelical majority. We were not. We actually will come out of that because we see that that is Babylon, because they are supporting slavery and they reject the Adventist doctrine. And so we come out of that intentionally. And so another point I want to stress is this, that what I'm finding in my research, I am confident to say that the Second Advent movement, Millerism and Seventh-day Adventism and other Millerite groups that come out of that disappointment, they are inseparable from the abolitionist movement. You really could not be a good Adventist and be pro-slavery. It just wasn't going to happen. So I want to talk about petitioning. This is a fun thing. A lot of Millerites and Seventh-day Adventists were involved in petitioning against slavery. And to talk about this, you need to know a few things about it. I don't know if any of you have signed petitions or maybe written your own. I actually do all the time now. I never had really petitioned much, but after I found out that our pioneers did, I have done so a lot. And I continually do it. And so you need to understand, though, at this time, to sign an abolitionist petition or to try to gather signatures for those petitions even was incredibly risky, because you're going around in your community and you're telling them your political views and you're trying to convince them to sign your petition. And this is really important because petitions, they are a multi-authorship document. In other words, there's a statement at the top of that thing, and all of the signatures there, everyone that's on there is virtually saying, I am the author, or I at least agree with what is on this paper as if I was the author. And so scholars talk about petitions as multi-authorship documents. And they're a very important form of political protest, both in the past and currently. And so it is very risky to do this, especially if you were a woman. And lots of women, lots of Millerite women were doing this. And if you want to read a very fascinating book about how women petitioning during the abolitionist movement led to the first women's rights movement to get female suffrage, you should check out Susan Zeiske's book called Signatures of Citizenship. There are many people who are very upset with the fact that women are involved, and I'm going to share a little bit about that in 2 seconds. And in fact, since I'm in my office, I'm going to grab a book off of my shelf. 2 seconds. And that's because I'm going to want to show you a picture. Okay, so the first set of petitions that I want to share with you and show you, they're dealing with trying to abolish slavery in the District of Columbia. And this was an important form of petition because since slavery was supported by the Constitution, at least that's what everyone assumed at the time, and it's very arguably true. Since slavery was supported by the Constitution, abolitionists did not believe that they could petition for its immediate abolition in the South. And so they thought, however, they might make progress if they could petition to abolish slavery in the nation's capital, the District of Columbia. And so a lot of petitions are for that. There's also a lot of petitions to prevent the annexation of new slave states like Texas or Florida, Arkansas. There's several. Texas was one of the biggest. And then sometimes people threw in petitions against the 1793 Fugitive Slave Law, which is going to be reinforced and strengthened in 1850 when Congress passes a whole lot of new measures that will strengthen this Fugitive Slave Act. And so let me show you some of these things. I found these in the National Archives. I spent a few weeks there, literally just combing through. They have thousands upon thousands of these things. And believe me, this is incredibly hard to go through and find Adventist signatures because you have no kind of finding aid. You have no idea where these petitions are located. I literally went in blind and said, I think there might be Seventh-day Adventists who signed these things. And so I didn't even know where the petition locations were. So I had to make lists, and I have made lists, and I continue to add to them of Seventh-day Adventists and Millerites, of where they lived at certain times. And then, hey, if I happen to find a petition in some archival box that says it's from this place, I'm like, hey, I know Adventists lived there. Let me see if someone signed it. And often I find that they did. And so what you see here is a petition against the annexation of Florida and Texas, also against the 1793 Fugitive Slave Law, and for the immediate abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia. So this petition is involving multiple issues in one. And I've put a star there by David Arnold. And I've also got a closer up picture with my finger pointing at it. You guys probably don't know who he is, but he was a very important figure in Seventh-day Adventist history. Whenever Joseph Bates finds a seventh-day Sabbath, and Hiram Edson found the sanctuary doctrine, and a few other people found the sanctuary doctrine, there was a Sabbath or Bible conference that was held in someone's barn, and they bring these doctrines together, which are going to become foundational for the Seventh-day Adventist movement. They held them in the barn of David Arnold. And so David Arnold very clearly here is expressing his abolitionism, and he is signing petitions to eradicate it. Now, this particular petition is from January 1, 1842, during the time when he was a Millerite. Okay, here's another person that you may not know. This petition is against the annexation of Texas. And this is signed by J.T. Orton. His full name was Jonathan T. Orton. And he was one of the leading Adventists in Rochester. And if you remember, Rochester, New York, between 1852 and 1855 is where Adventist headquarters were. We had our printing office there, publishing, etc. And that's where James and Ellen White lived, etc., and lots of other people. So Jonathan Orton is a very, in fact, there were enough Adventists in Rochester during the 1852 to 1853 that they held 3 services during the week. And one of them was held regularly at Jonathan Orton's home. And so he was a very important early Seventh-day Adventist as well. Here we have a couple. This petition is for the immediate abolition of slavery in the District of Columbia and against admitting Florida or Texas as slave states. And look over here on the right, you see Harry G. Buck, and underneath him, John Byington, 2 Adventist pioneers. Now, John Byington was probably more important and definitely more recognizable because he became the first General Conference president. He was a very radical abolitionist. He operated a stop on the Underground Railroad, and he was a member of the Liberty Party, which was advocating for the immediate and total abolition of slavery and for equal rights for Black people in America. And so he is here signing a petition, and I'm particularly excited about this because his biographer, historian that just wrote his biography, was unable to locate, really because he never looked, any petitions that John Byington signed. And so I have found one to show that he actually, in fact, did sign petitions. Now, the next thing that you need to know is another set of petitions are about the congressional gag laws. And you may not be aware of this, but during Andrew Jackson's presidency, and I have no problem saying I think he was one of the very worst presidents that we've ever had in our history, he did several things. He was instrumental. He was the one driving force for Indian removal that led to the Trail of Tears and thousands of Native Americans dying and white settlers just taking their land and exploiting it and getting rich and wealthy. He did that. He also is the one who appointed Roger B. Taney, who had already been found guilty in the eyes of public opinion for violating various laws that Jackson wanted him to do for him. Jackson appointed him Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And it was Roger B. Taney, in fact, who gave the majority opinion for the infamous case of involving, oh my word, it just escaped my brain. I'm thinking now the only name that's coming to my mind is Nat Turner, but it's Dred Scott. Sorry about that. Dred Scott was a decision made by the Supreme Court in the late 1850s that said that black people were not entitled to the same rights as white people. So it was a hugely important and major decision in a negative sense. Andrew Jackson puts Tawney there. He also is the one who enacts, when Congress is going on, it's under his presidency that Congress enacts these things called gag laws. And these laws were put into effect first in 1836 and lasted until 1844. And what they specified is that Congress would not listen to any petitions advocating for the abolition of slavery. And so if you wrote petitions to Congress, they were going to just throw them away. And so that was Jackson. And so a lot of abolitionists wrote petitions against this because it was an infringement upon the freedom of speech, which is a First Amendment right. And so here we have a petition signed by citizens in the state of Maine. This is actually a petition from the Maine State Archive, not the National Archives. And I've got 2 stars there, and these people are really important for Adventist history. It says Betsy White and Elizabeth White. Betsy White was James White's mother, and Elizabeth White was his oldest sister. And they were, in fact, the only women in his family legally able to, because Elizabeth was 18, they were the only ones that, not legally able to, but for this particular petition, they only wanted people who were an adult. Actually, there were anti-slavery petitions that gathered children's signatures, which is really interesting too. But this particular petition wanted people who were just an adult age. And so the only 2 women in his family that could have signed this petition did. And so that's really interesting and really cool too. You also have this one, petitions against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And that was an act that was passed in 1854 that specified that slavery could in fact extend further west, and that it didn't have to, the line that had divided the North and the South didn't really mean anything anymore. And so the North was outraged by that, in short. And here we have the signature of J.B. Frisbee. He was a Seventh-day Adventist minister, Joseph Burchard, actually Frisbee, that's his full name. And he's protesting in the 1850s as a Seventh-day Adventist against this unjust act, an unjust law. This one is really fun. And we are moving to more radical petitions as I'm going. And so there were some Millerites. I haven't found any Seventh-day Adventists yet, but it wouldn't surprise me in the least, who signed disunion petitions. Now, what are these? These are petitions where people in the North said, we want the North to secede from the South because we want no part to do with slavery whatsoever. So this is long before the Civil War. And the Civil War started with the South actually seceding from the North. But there was a time when abolitionists were so radical that they said, let's split America, but let's split it now on our own terms peacefully so that we don't have to participate and be guilty of the sin of slavery. And here we have George O. Harmon, not a relative that I know of to Ellen White, but nevertheless, he was one of the people sort of instrumental in creating the Millerite Prophecy Chart of 1843. And this petition is, quote, to bring about peacefully a division to these United States into 2 separate and distinct governments, slavery to be the dividing line between said governments. I have not seen many of these petitions, so these are rare. And so to find one signed by a Millerite is very interesting indeed. However, he's probably not the only one, although it is the only one I've found. Now, Millerites and Seventh-day Adventists also had care for and concern for international things. They were not just concerned about America and slavery in America. And that is clear in their petitions for the U.S. to recognize the independence of Haiti. And to give you important background here, Haiti fought for its independence. And when I mean fought, and when I mean Haiti, I mean black slaves. And it's in fact, the only successful slave revolt in human history where they liberated themselves in the early 1800s. And it took a while, but they did it. And America was so afraid of slave revolts and doing anything to affirm and recognize Haitian independence that they refused to do so until Abraham Lincoln took office, and they finally did so in 1862 in the middle of the Civil War. But before that, Millerites and Seventh-day Adventists were among Americans who said, look, France and other countries around the world, in Europe, etc., they've already recognized Haitian independence. And France was key because they took it from France. And so the fact that France had given recognized Haitian independence and America had not, just simply spelled out how racist America was during this time. And so here we have several Adventists who signed these petitions. This is to recognize the independence of Haiti, signed by Stockbridge Howland and his wife Louisa Howland. You can see there with my finger pointing at them. And the Howlands, they lived in Topsham, Maine, and they were extremely close friends with the whites. And let me stress how close they were. If the whites had, they didn't use the term, but if they had, the Howlands would have been essentially their godparents to the whites' kids. Ellen White and James traveled so frequently that they had to let their children be raised by other people. And so they left their children with the Howlands for them to raise them there. And they stayed there for years. In fact, when Henry White, the Whites' firstborn son, dies, he dies at their home in the middle of the Civil War. And so they were very, very, very close to Stockbridge and Louisa Howland. And they're signing one of the most radical types of petitions that was available at the time to recognize Haitian independence, to affirm, in essence, the legitimacy of the violence that had taken place to liberate the slaves. I mean, please don't underestimate how radical this petition is. It is incredibly radical. You also have here E.A. Poole. He was one of our Adventist ministers. His name was Ezra A. Poole. And Ezra Poole has a very interesting position in history because in the early 1830s, even before he signs his petition, before he becomes a Seventh-day Adventist, he was a member of the so-called Lane Rebels, which are talked about in the history books. And this is when several theology students were at one school, the Lane Theological Seminary. Lyman Beecher was the president, and the topic of abolition comes up in the early 1830s. And it's so, it stirs up the students so much that the administration of the university outlaws and forbids them to ever talk about immediate abolition of slavery at the school. And so in response to that, well-renowned abolitionist Theodore Dwight Weld and about 20, is it something like that, other people revolt. They withdraw from the school and they go help found Oberlin College in Ohio. Ezra Poole was one of them. And in fact, he was one of Theodore Dwight Weld's inner circle. So whenever they resist and leave their school because they will not allow them to talk about the abolition of slavery, Ezra Poole, one other person, and Theodore Dwight Weld, they build a raft, sail down a creek until they get to the river, and then they float down the river all the way to Ohio to get to Oberlin. And what they're doing along the way is they're holding religious revival meetings where they are blending that with the abolition of slavery. And so that's how close Ezra Poole was to Theodore Dwight Weld. And you can see all sorts of stuff about Weld on Wikipedia or whatever else. And so he is also an Adventist minister later, and he signs a petition for the U.S. to recognize the independence of Haiti. I'm not showing it here, but Joseph Bates and his wife, Joseph Bates being one of the founders of our church, they also signed these petitions as well. And in their case, they also circulated them and gathered signatures for them.
I know, right?
Now, let me share with you some more radical petitions. People have assumed that the idea of Jim Crow segregation, where you have like white-only sections, segregated transportation, like white people have to sit in the front of the bus, black people have to sit in the back of the bus, this kind of thing, where restaurants will only serve white people or whatever, that kind of thing. People have assumed that Jim Crow laws are a Southern invention, and they were not. They were invented in the North, and that's because the South didn't need Jim Crow. They just enslaved everyone, okay? But the North didn't have that liberty. They let all the slaves go free, and so to subjugate the black people in the North, they created Jim Crow laws. So you couldn't, if you wanted to ride on a train, you had to ride in the Negro car. also, if you were Irish, you had to ride in the paddy car. So they segregated it for Irish. And I could go into detail about that because Irish were not considered white at the time, even though they had the same color of skin I do. But that gets into the history of race, which we're not covering now. But they also segregated the Irish. If you wanted to eat at a restaurant, you couldn't eat at the same table as a white person if you were black. In church, you had to sit in the Negro pew. So they segregated church services. And if it was communion, you had to wait till all the white people got up and had communion before you. And then after that, then you could go up and get communion at the very, very end. And I could go on and on. There are many of these kinds of laws that are in the North, and they call them, specifically for the train cars, they call them the Jim Crow car. And so the actual terminology was invented in the North too. And Adventists were petitioning against this. They wanted equal rights for the oppressed. And so they fought for that. So here is a signature by Mary Nichols. And she is trying to have Massachusetts, the state of Massachusetts, abolish all the laws that any distinction among its inhabitants on the account of color exists. So in other words, a wide sweeping statement against all Jim Crow laws in the state of Massachusetts. Now, who was Mary Nichols? Mary Nichols was the wife of Otis Nichols, and Otis Nichols is the one who publishes the Seventh-day Adventist prophecy chart that was published in 1850 that all of our ministers are going around and preaching from. She was very important and also very, very close with the whites. And she's one of the people signing petitions to eradicate Jim Crow laws in the North, to eradicate segregation in the North. You also see here William Gifford. He was a radical Seventh-day Adventist abolitionist, also Underground Railroad operator. You see Joseph Bates over here and his wife Prudence, or P.M. Bates, as she signed her signature there. And they are eradicating the law that said that white people and black people, or white people and mulattoes, that was a mixed race person, or white people and Native Americans couldn't intermarry. And so Joseph Bates is actually circulating these along with his wife. They are circulating these petitions. And this is where I want to show you a picture. So I'm going to stop sharing for a hot second and I'm going to come back. So can you see my screen now? You see this picture here? It's a picture of a bunch of black men dancing with white ladies. And the artist has intentionally tried to make the black men look like baboons. It's a very, very racist cartoon. And they're dancing with white women. And if you take a few moments to analyze that, you will realize this entire image is about sex. And the thing is, that image is drawn and put in newspapers because women in Massachusetts were the ones to start petitioning against this interracial marriage law. And so in 1839, a bunch of women, including Prudence Bates, Joseph Bates' wife, are signing these petitions. Mary Nichols signs it too, by the way. There are several Adventists who do. What racist Northerners start to do is say that all of these white women are signing these petitions because all they want to do is get married with or have sex with black men. That's literally the argument that comes up because they are so racist, they cannot imagine them to just want to eradicate a racist law. And of course, this was never popular. I mean, never more than maybe even 1% or probably even less than that in the state of Massachusetts would ever even dare to sign a petition like this. Okay, so when we're talking about Seventh-day Adventists here, they are in the tiniest of the tiniest kind of minority to sign a petition like this. And so what happens is Joseph Bates and other men in America, in Massachusetts specifically, in 1840, they start to sign petitions and circulate petitions to uphold the women's virtue and honor and say, no, we also are against this law. We also do not want there to be a law that says white and black people can't get married to one another. And you know what is amazing about this? Phenomenal, in fact, is that Massachusetts in 1843 abolishes this law. It's the first state in America who had a law that outlawed interracial marriage that overturns it. And they overturn it decades and decades before any other state is going to do the same thing. And Joseph Bates and Prudence and other Seventh-day Adventists are involved in that process to overthrow that racist and unjust law. And so when we talk about Seventh-day Adventist history and we talk about how they were working to overcome systemic racism, let's talk about them signing petitions. Okay? let me share a couple more with you. When you get to the 1860s, the Seventh-day Adventist Church takes the name Seventh-day Adventist in 1860. And whenever you get to the 1860s, you actually happen to find sometimes that there are Seventh-day Adventists who actually put the name of the denomination in the petition. Okay, and so I'm going to show you one that we have found, Seventh-day Adventist petitioning for the immediate and total abolition of slavery. And take a look at this. I don't know if you can see it very well. The top of it is right up here. I have the whole petition for you on the left. It's got 44 signatures on it, almost all of them Seventh-day Adventists. Here is what it says at the top. To the President of the United States and to Congress, the undersigned Seventh-day Adventists and others, citizens of Lynn County in the state of Iowa. And so you actually see Seventh-day Adventists as a religious body deciding that they have to petition against the injustice in their land. And so they do. And so I actually have a quote from this petition here, and I'm going to read it for you. They say that no question of the right can now be entertained under existing circumstances of our national government to proclaim liberty to all the inhabitants of the land. That our professions of Christianity and boasts of liberty are but a mockery in the sight of the nations of the earth and of the God of the universe, so long as we delay practically to recognize the, quote, inalienable right of all men to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We therefore urge you, as the executive and representative personifications of our national government, by all the considerations of self-preservation and of allegiance to justice and to God, to abolish by proclamation and without delay the great unnatural crime, the exhaustless and inveterate source of our national ruin. And that petition was signed and circulated by Seventh-day Adventists in April 1862. And so when we talk about Seventh-day Adventist history, when we talk about abolitionist heritage, I'm not messing around. We were thoroughly abolitionist. We were dedicated to abolishing slavery and advocating for equal rights for the oppressed. Now, have we been going for about half an hour? I think we have.
Yeah, we've been going down.
Okay, so I can stop now and we can discuss this if you would like.
Yeah, we could take some questions. If people have questions, we could take them right now.
Okay.
And talk about them. So I will open it up to the audience. I don't know if anyone has any question from what Kevin has talked so far.
Yeah, I actually have a question.
Great.
You know, I mean, it was very enlightening, and I thank you for that presentation. You know, and I realized in the chat we were kind of talking about how it would look like now, and that's one of the questions I have. What are some of the things we can do, in your opinion, to kind of make some of those changes, and why are more people not probably doing that?
Yeah, no, those are Michael, is that right?
Yes. Yes.
Those are really important questions, and I can give you answers, but they're going to be a little long. I always think they're going to be short, but let me just, for lack of a better phrase, explain it in more detail. And so they're important. First part of your question, what can we do? I probably won't have time in this presentation to go into the details, but I have presented it in the last few days elsewhere, and these videos are online on Facebook, YouTube, whatever, about how Seventh-day Adventists incorporated abolitionist ideology into their fundamental beliefs, into the three angels' messages, so that everywhere they're going, I just shared petitions with you because it's something that no one knows about. Yeah, I had to find those in the National Archives, okay? It's not something that's been in the review. Like, we literally had totally forgot about the fact that we were doing this. And so that's why I shared that. But it might be more powerful, perhaps, to say that Adventists were thoroughly bringing all of these arguments into the three angels' messages, so that they are warning, as the first angel says, the hour of judgment has come. Adventists say over and over again, if you're pro-slavery, you're going to be damned unless you repent. So you better shape up quick. And I'm saying pro-slavery. I'm not saying there were no Adventist slaveholders, but there were a few, just a few, a handful that were pro-slavery. And when they came out of the woodwork, boy, Ellen White lit into a fire. And we could go into that. But they made it emphatically clear time and time again through the Millerite movement and the Seventh-day Adventist movement, if you are harboring pro-slavery sympathies, you're going to go to hell. And for Adventists, that means you're going to go there and be annihilated. For Millerites, that primarily meant that you were going to go there to burn forever in torment. Okay, so that's the first angel's message. Okay, behold, the hour of his judgment has come. And that's the message that Millerites were preaching. Number two is fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. And by the way, this is all from Revelation 14. Hopefully you guys know that already, but Revelation 14, 6 through 12, I believe, are the three angels' messages. And so the second angel says, fallen, fallen is Babylon the Great. Well, you see that echoed again in Revelation chapter 18, where it says, come out of her, my people, in verse 4. And so Seventh-day Adventists recognize, and Millerites recognized, that almost all evangelicals, North and South, supported slavery. They refused to condemn it. They refused to admit that slaveholding was a sin. I'm serious. Almost all evangelicals would not admit that slaveholding was a sin. Okay, and so Adventists agreed during the Millerite period in the 1840s that if that is the case, then the Protestant churches, the evangelical churches, are also Babylon. So you must come out of her, that you do not partake in her sins. And they were clear on this, because in Revelation 18, later on, you see a list of those sins from like verses, I think it's 11 or maybe 10 through 13. And that enlists by saying that Babylon engages in selling slaves in the souls of men. And so Adventists said, that is Babylon. If you support slavery, you are part of Babylon, and you must come out of her and stay out. And so when Ellen White found out that there were some pro-slavery Adventists in the Adventist church, she sees and vision this, and she writes in Testimonies, volume number 1, and she says, we must disfellowship them. If they hold these sympathies in their heart, they have got to go. I can actually read it to you because I have it open right here. She says, unless she's writing to one in particular named Alexander Ross, the only one that we know by name who was supported slavery in the Adventist church. She says, unless you undo what you have done, because she shared his views publicly, unless you undo what you have done, it will be the duty of God's people to publicly withdraw their sympathy and fellowship from you. In order to save the impression, we must go out in regard to us as a people. We must let it be known that we have no such ones in our fellowship, that we will not walk with them in church capacity. Ellen White is saying this to someone who does not own slaves. She's saying this to a racist white man in America and say, we want to protect the reputation of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And if you're going to go around and say that you're supporting slavery, you are not part of us and you must go. And that is a powerful thing to say. So it wasn't just that you come out of Babylon, it's that you stay out. You stay out. Okay, now the third angel's message talks about how people are going to worship the beast in his image and receive the mark of the beast on their forehead and on their hand. Okay, well, you look back at Revelation 13 and say, well, who is this beast? What is this worship about? What is this mark of the beast, 666, all that kind of, where does that come from? It comes from the fact that a beast that rises out of the earth with two horns, it looks like a lamb, but speaks like a dragon, is compelling people to worship the beast that came out of the sea. In other words, who Adventists identified as the papacy. It's compelling them to do that, and it will do so by force and make them receive the mark of the beast on their hand. And so Seventh-day Adventists did not simply connect this with an issue of blue laws and a national Sunday law that was coming down the pike. They said those horns on that beast represent civil liberty and religious liberty. And those are good things. And America looks like a lamb because it's promising to give religious and civil liberty, social liberty to its inhabitants, to its citizens. But it speaks like a dragon because it is denying civil liberty, equal rights for racial minorities, and it's denying religious liberty to religious minorities. And they said for that reason, if you're supporting those things, you have the mark of the beast. You are worshiping the beast in his image. And if you don't change your ways, you are bowing down to an idol, and you will be lost. And these are the kinds of ways, in a nutshell, that Seventh-day Adventists, before the Civil War was over, were intertwining in every way, and everywhere they're preaching, the three angels' messages with abolition. Okay, the second part of Michael's question, what changed? This is where it gets long. In a nutshell, but it's still, I'm going to have to give broad strokes here. It's critical to understand that Seventh-day Adventists believed that Protestant churches were Babylon. And so they were emphatic that you had to stay out of evangelicalism. After the Civil War, things start to shift in America very, very quickly. Charles Darwin had written his treatises on evolution in 1844. He starts, and they get published in 1859, The Origin of Species. And so after the Civil War, it wasn't until after the Civil War that Americans started to really get interested in evolution, because the Civil War and other things were distracting them beforehand. And so after the Civil War, very quickly, that becomes a thing. And more Protestants in America are becoming quote unquote liberal. They are also becoming willing to throw out the Bible. And so that's important. And a group of people rise up to hold a conservative line, and that's the evangelicals. A lot of them stay true to the Bible, at least in their interpretations of it, which are very problematic, by the way. And they also reject evolution. And so Seventh-day Adventists see some common heritage forming that didn't exist before. You also had the evangelicals shifting and their eschatology. That's the belief of the last day events. So before the Civil War, the dominant theology was called postmillennialism, the belief that Christ is coming after a millennium of peace. So a millennium of peace is going to happen on earth before Christ returns. Adventists were premillennialists. Christ comes before the millennium of peace. Beginning in the 1870s, evangelicals by and large started to accept premillennial dispensationalism. And so that also, even though there was fine-tuning differences, major differences between the two, evangelicals and Adventists, they started to agree on some common points, and they start to attend prophecy conferences together and things like this. And so this is critical. Then you have this sort of relationship continuing to build during these years, so much to when we get to World War I, stuff starts to really clearly shift. Around that time, evangelicals started to say, hey, we're uncomfortable with Adventists. You guys have a female prophet. We don't think women should preach in church or have authority over men. So that's an issue. We don't like you at all. And so that's part of it. Also, some of this stuff about sanctuary doctrine and the Sabbath, I mean, we're not dealing with you at all. And so you're a cult. And so they started to call Seventh-day Adventists a cult in the World War I era. And that's at the same time when the so-called counter-cult movement is rising. And their evangelicals are saying so many different people are cults, and Adventists just get thrown into that. And Adventists want to overcome that reputation. And so they're going to work to do so for the next decades. But probably more significant than that is the fact that during World War I, Adventists had a huge confrontation with the state. And this is something I uncovered in my research, which is not widely known yet. And that is the fact that what we now call the Federal Bureau of Investigation, they looked at Adventists and said, we are really suspicious of you guys. And so they infiltrated our churches and camp meetings, and they heavily surveilled us. They were watching all of our publishing houses, our sanitariums, our schools. They were convinced that Adventists were socialists and communists and just publishing red stuff. They thought we were overrun with German spies, maybe even Bolshevik spies from Russia. And so, I mean, it got ludicrous. There was at one point where they were convinced from the testimony of one woman that Seventh-day Adventists at the General Conference headquarters were sending secret signals to German spies at night. And they actually sent an agent to go investigate. And he actually did. And he said, you know what? That's actually just the night watchman shining his flashlight around. There's no receiver. There's nothing. So, I mean, some of this stuff is actually just laughable. Okay. But it was serious. It was serious. And one of the things that they do not like about Adventists is the fact that we have a doctrine that says America is the two-horned beast of Revelation 13. As a matter of fact, they didn't like that or find it flattering. It was un-American, 100% American. I mean, this patriotism is at its height during World War I. It's huge. And so they come to us and say, you must change or go to prison for a long time. And they were not joking, because the group that we now call Jehovah's Witnesses, they had just sentenced their leaders, to 80 years in prison to serve 4 consecutive terms of 20 years. So in effect, only 20 years. But nevertheless, they had just done that. And literally 4 days after that, they come to us, literally 4 days later. And they say, either you change what you're printing and publishing and discontinue some publications, or you go to prison. And Adventists, unlike the Jehovah's Witnesses, they said, okay, we'll change. And they did. They stopped some publications. They revised others. And some of those they specified. And so you can see in tracts that were published during World War I where they say passed by the chief military censor, and they give a date on there. Others, however, they never disclosed the fact that they changed them. And one of those was an all-important book called Bible Readings for the Home Circle, one of the most important colporting books in Adventist history. Okay, and in that book, there's the doctrine of the two-horned beast. And they changed this doctrine of the two-horned beast explicitly in that book. And so here's what they change. Before World War I, Adventists are saying that America right now is this two-horned beast because it's violating civil and religious liberties of people, not just the National Sunday Law, and it is right now, not a future date. America's not going to become the two-horned beast at some point in the future. It is right now the two-horned beast. And so that right there gets shifted. And what they change in Bible Readings for the Home Circle is they say, no, America's not really the two-horned beast now. No, it's too great of a country. But eventually it's going to pass a national Sunday law, and then it's going to become a two-horned beast because it's really going to hurt Seventh-day Adventists. And so they shift that and they make that change. And they also go further and they say, but it's not really the federal government. It's really just liberal Protestants that are eventually going to become so powerful in America that they take over the federal government. And so it's really just liberal Protestants in America. They are the ones that will eventually take over, and they are the ones that are the two-horned beast, not America, not the federal government. And they stop talking about civil injustices. They essentially lop off one of the horns of that beast and they make it into a unicorn. Okay? And all of this is happening at the time, keep in mind, where Adventists are really wanting to get close with evangelicals for theological reasons and other reasons. And so they're going to do so. And as they get closer to evangelicals, they start to align more with their social principles. Evangelicals had always been socially conservative, always felt like racism has always been a major problem in evangelicalism, still is to this day, always has been. The abolitionist movement brings that out very clearly for the first time. We start to have white people in America for the first time saying slavery's got to go now. And also they should have equal rights. And so that draws that out and makes it very clear that evangelicals had really always been socially conservative. And so as Adventists are trying to draw closer and closer together with evangelicals to align with theological things and fight a common enemy, liberal Protestantism that's throwing out the Bible and throwing out evolution and advocating evolution. And let me just specify, I'm glad we wanted to keep the Bible, and I'm glad that we fought against evolution. Let me just stress that. But these things came at a cost. They came at a social cost because as we got closer to the evangelicals, we started to align more with their social principles. And it eventually gets to the point where we are able to convince a couple of evangelical ministers, Walter Martin and Donald Barnhouse, I think. And so we get them to, we write a book called Questions on Doctrine and convince them that we are two evangelicals. And they end up writing books and articles and say, yeah, you're right, evangelicals are no longer a cult. And then Adventist victory. But by that time, we have marched far afield from where we went to where when you get to the civil rights movement, you're going to see the editor of the review, white editor of the review, F.D. Nickel, who tells Adventists, you cannot get involved with the civil rights movement because it's political. And the church and the Three Angels message can have nothing to do with politics. And we repeat, Adventists, white Adventists today still repeat this argument to this day, okay? It's still going around. It's going around a lot right now. And you know what's happening at the exact same time in the 1960s where Adventist leaders are saying, don't get involved in the civil rights movement? Take a look at this. You see that picture? That's a picture of Seventh-day Adventists. Can you see what they're doing? They're marching. The caption of this picture says this: 1,000 Adventist college students speak out against tobacco in a big way with a 7-mile march, complete with placards and banners. So they're holding up signs, picketing, ban the butt. You don't want it. Stop cancer now. You know, all this kind of stuff. They're holding these signs up and marching. And We don't want to get involved in politics. We don't want to get involved in politics, people. We can't support the civil rights movement, but yet we're going to go and do the exact same things, do the exact same tactics that they're using in the civil rights movement. What we have, folks, is a clear sign that that was an excuse to hide and mask the racism in white Adventism during the 1960s. And so much changed. And so, Michael, I hope that's the best answer I can give you right now. It needs a lot more study, a lot more research, but that's the best answer I can give in a nutshell right now. I hope it was clear.
Yes, very clear, man. I totally understand. I'm like, when can we get you at our church, man? That's what I'm trying to. That's what I'm trying to figure out. Because yeah, we have another meeting coming up real quick. But I mean, this was very enlightening. I mean, and
Okay.
even yeah.
Kevin, I just want to follow up a little bit on what you said there, and this would have to be more so. You've given us this perspective of our pioneers and their willingness to stand up and to speak out. And then when you talk about this shift where I guess the church or its membership begin to shift to this identity politics type of a deal. Now, what is it that we can do today? What can we do? You know, as college students, as maybe just even young adults, what is it that we can do to maybe, in a sense, I guess, revive that spirit of our pioneers back? Because I think it becomes easy, right? And it's good headline. But we say, oh, our pioneers stood up for all of this. But, you know, the pioneers are long gone. We are the ones now that are holding that flag for the church. What is it that we can do?
I think that what I'm doing is I'm trying to help people understand the history. That's a part that I'm trying to play. But what other people can do who are maybe not historians is I think you can get out there on the streets, or, you know, some people need to be out there on the streets. Some people that drives them. I mean, we clearly didn't have a problem with it when it came to certain topics. And the topic of racism is in no way a problem. Like, I mean, it shouldn't be a problem for us to fight against it, because you really shouldn't be able to be a good Seventh-day Adventist in good standing and be racist. It really shouldn't happen. And so I think that you can get out on the streets. I think you can sign petitions. I think you can do just about any form of protest, provided that you do not engage in violence. That's the most important principle that I see. Adventists were nonviolent by and large. However, we did have a number who fought in the Civil War, and they did use weapons. But nevertheless, as a principle, we were clear that you should not engage in violence. And so nonviolent protests, there are a wide variety. And I think it is very clear from our heritage that we can participate in those kinds of things because our pioneers were doing so. And so I would hope that Adventists go bold. We have the most racially diverse religion, not just Christian, racially diverse religion in America. I think that we should try to own that and try to lead by example, and we have not been leading by example. And so I would recommend that everybody gets out there and engages themselves in this to protest against racial injustice. It cannot happen. And it probably will exist until Christ comes again, but that shouldn't stop us from participating in protesting against it and also living it. That's even more important. In our churches, in our schools, in our homes, do not engage in the so-called acts that people are doing. Like, embrace each other. Live by example. Show that we love each other and that we truly care. Not just lip service, but actually do it and practice it and live it. Our pioneers did that as well. They were not afraid to sleep in the same homes. White pioneers were not afraid to sleep in a black person's home, and they did it at a time when almost all Americans, even in the North, wouldn't even walk down the same side of the sidewalk with a black person, okay? Our pioneers ate at their tables. They went and slept in their beds. And black pioneers, they slept in white homes and ate at white tables and all this kind of stuff, and they lived it. We did not segregate our churches, and we had people who called us out, particularly during the Millerite movement, because we associated with black people and sat together next to one another. And that was damnable. That was damnable. And we did it and we didn't care. And so you have to live it as well as getting out there and protest. And so I would say, live it, do it, and also finally, do not stop doing it. And here's particularly a message to white Adventists. White Adventists have a privilege that they may not recognize. And that is the simple fact that me and other people like me have never been targeted and killed on a consistent basis in this country because we are white. It has not happened. It probably never will happen. And so we don't understand, but that's not the way it is for Black Americans. They have been targeted and killed and assaulted in various forms for centuries. It is still a problem today. It has always been a problem in this country. And so white people have the privilege, because we are not being oppressed, to stop protesting. Protesting is hard work and it is exhausting. It is really tiring. And Black Americans have never had the privilege to stop because they are the ones being oppressed. But white Americans have many times in the past rose up, strong voice of protest, did it for a while, and then they got tired. Other things took their attention, they got distracted, whatever it is, and they just stopped. And they have that privilege to do that because they are not the ones being oppressed. And so what I would really hope that white Adventists would get is that do not stop this time. Keep fighting with our Black brothers and sisters and other races in this country, which are in the same kind of a boat. I mean, if we want to talk about racial oppression now, we really have to talk about Hispanics too, because of the issues with immigration, which have been going on far too long in this country, violating all kinds of the laws of God. And it is appalling to me that we are allowing these things to happen. Separating husbands from their wives. It's a violation of the commandments of God, and taking away children from their parents. We cannot be doing this. And the Bible is very clear over and over again that foreigners should be allowed to dwell among you and not be oppressed. And so we are not following the commandments of God at all as a nation right now. America is still and always has been the two-horned beast because of civil issues and religious issues. And we have to continue to uphold that message, reclaim it, make it relevant to today. Talk about George Floyd and other people who have been murdered because of their race. Talk about how that as part of our doctrine, because it is and it should be. Talk about what's going on with immigration issues. Talk about other issues of racism. Talk about other issues of civil rights. Talk about other issues of religious rights. All of that is part of our doctrine, our fundamental beliefs about the three angels' messages, because you cannot take away the two-horned beast from that. It's an intimate, important, vital part of that. And so we have to recover that. We have to take the principles our pioneers had, and we have to make it present for today. So preach about the two-horned beast. It's a beast now, and say why it's the beast now. Say how we're violating in this country religious liberty and civil injustice. Make people get it. Make people see it. Do good research, okay, so that people can understand and know that you know what you're talking about. And so those are some of the ways, Lucian, that I think Adventists can participate and speak out now and today.
Kevin, I have a question.
Yeah.
So do you know off the top of your head when the first time that there were large marches? I know that Gandhi did a lot of marches in India. Was it a thing back with our Adventist pioneers?
Yeah, that's a good question. I was trying to think of that earlier because I wondered if somebody was going to ask, and I just genuinely wanted to know. We didn't, in the 19th century, I don't know of any, and I've read a lot of books on abolitionism. I don't know of any marches. I think, and I mean, maybe I am wrong, so I want to keep that caveat there, but I don't know of it happening until the 20th century.
Because I know that what you've done today is to say we have a lot of, on-brand early Adventists that were participating in the tools of civil protests of their days. And I imagine that if there were an example of these on-brand early pioneers participating in marches, that would sway modern Adventist opinion on whether or not we should be encouraged to do so. The fact that marches just weren't a commonplace thing or extant at all in that period makes it a little bit harder for us to say, well, if they were today, they would do this or they would not do it.
Right. I understand. It's kind of funny that the mentality exists, but that's the way Adventists have been. Like, we had been ordaining women as deaconesses for decades, for example, and then the first church manual in 1932 forbade it. And we stopped ordaining women as deaconesses for the rest of the 20th century. And it wasn't until, actually almost the rest of the 20th, it wasn't until the 1980s when a historian found out that Ellen White's son, Willie White, ordained a woman as a deaconess. And then once that happened, we could say, okay, yeah, we can ordain deaconesses again. And so it's a very humorous kind of thing, but I get it to a degree. I understand. We do want to stay true to our heritage, but we have to remember we have forgotten so much about our history. Ellen White said, I don't know the exact quote, but she said, woe unto us. This is definitely not the right words that she says, but she said, woe unto us if you forget your history. That's such a loose paraphrase. And yet we have some of the most important things of our history we have forgotten. I mean, it's terrible and sad, but if you want an aspect of our heritage, this is something right here we're real proud of. I mean, and I'm proud of it too, actually. I'm glad that we had a bunch of Adventists in the 1960s marching against tobacco. I'm proud of that. I'm disappointed that they were doing that and saying, yeah, this is okay, but marching in the civil rights movement is somehow not okay. I'm disappointed in that. But we have marches in our past. And so we can embrace that even if it wasn't the pioneers. And we should be proud of the history we have of smoking, because Adventists played a huge role in our government's and our nation's history in helping make some really positive changes. Like, for example, cigarette packages have those warnings on there that say cigarettes kill. That's to a significant degree, actually, through Adventist political effort. And so we shouldn't throw that under the bus just because we're talking about racism. But yeah, Jonathan, you're right. I mean, it would probably help a lot of Adventists today if we could say, yeah, there was marches back then, and Adventists did that all the time. But I don't think there were marches back then.
The next best thing you can do is to say, just because Adventists weren't marching the not the Old Testament, the 19th century, doesn't mean that they wouldn't do such today, because nobody was marching in the 19th century. But
exactly.
Adventists were usually on the cutting edge of just about everything. I mean, they were the first people, from my understanding, one of the first large groups of people to use multiple colors when they were printing posters and stuff. You're saying they were on the edge when it came to petitions. And so, yeah,
when it comes to,
we should have been the first ones to do hashtags.
Well, we eventually started not being the first on some things, or being in the, I think part of the reason that we were so radical in our early days is because we were speaking from a position as a understood, self-proclaimed, and embraced minority. Adventism as a religion was a minority religion, and we embraced that and we wanted it. And it's amazing to think about this, and I haven't shared this before, and I don't know how people will take to it, but think about this. Seventh-day Adventist doctrine is anti-democratic. Now, let me explain my terms, because so many people love the term democracy right now. And I'm not anti-democratic in this. I'll explain. Fundamental principle of democracy is majority rules. That's a fundamental principle of democracy. That's how it functions. That's how it's supposed to function. I'm not against that necessarily, okay? But let me explain what I mean when I say Adventists were anti-democratic. We embraced remnant ideology. That means we are inverting that democratic principle and say the majority, evangelicals were convinced that the majority of Christendom was going to be saved. That's why they had the millennium before the 1,000 years. So that there would be 1,000 years to convert almost everyone in the world before Christ came to judge. Adventists inverted that. They said the judgment comes first. That means only a small number of people are going to be saved, and everyone's going to be lost. That's very anti-democratic, because it inverts that principle, and it makes a minority ruling over a majority. That's a dominant minority. That's called dominant minority rule in political terms. And so Adventism at its fundamental principle is not supportive of democracy to that in that way. Okay. And so that is where we were speaking from. And whenever we wanted to become like evangelicals and to get in close with that evangelical culture, we've tried to throw that away. And in fact, I have for so many years in my own life been embarrassed by the remnant theology that we've had. And it's only been more recently when I'm getting into this, I'm like, oh my word, this was really cool. When you connect it with like racial justice and you connect it with like all these other kinds of things, talking about a remnant, that is pretty epic actually. And so I'm really chill with that now. Whereas I used to be like, that's embarrassing. It sounds so exclusionary and all this kind of stuff. It's never been exclusionary. We've always been willing to let people come in, but we've been wanting to let them in on very clear terms. If you support slavery in any form or fashion, if you're not supporting equal rights for the oppressed, you can't be part of us. And we don't have that anymore. And so now we're speaking out. We're doing this meeting now. We're having these discussions now because George Floyd got killed in a violent way. It was videoed, and so we can prove it and see it. And everyone in America, not everyone, but so many people in America are doing this right now. And Adventists are now just part of the crowd. Are we going to keep doing this when everyone else stops talking about it? Are we going to keep protesting when we again become the minority and no one else is really talking about racial justice? That's when you speak out and have authority. That's when you're radical, when no one else is doing it or hardly anyone else is doing it. And so that's why our pioneers were pretty epic, in my opinion.
Okay, Kevin, this is good. There is a question here that is on Facebook, and I think that this would tie into this very well. Given that in the previous question you had talked about the fact that we can lead on this issue, just in our lifestyle and so on. Now, the spirit of our pioneers somewhat disappeared from the church in the 50s, 60s time, and then we led to desegregation of our churches. So this question goes that how then can we lead on this issue when we have so many, our conferences and our leadership becomes split on racial lines, and it still exists today in North America and some parts of Africa. How can we be leaders now in this issue when we detach ourselves from our pioneers and went this other direction?
Yeah, that's a good question. Another huge question. So whenever Adventists start going down and evangelizing in the South, they made it a point to try their best to educate Blacks, to help uplift them socially by teaching them the gospel. So Edson White, Ellen White's son, builds the Morning Star. He publishes a gospel primer to where he teaches people how to read through the Bible. And they are having Black people come on the board of their boat and teach them how to read. It gets so violent in the South, in Yazoo City and several other towns in the South down the Mississippi River, that some Adventists are assaulted. Death threats become very common. And it's all because Adventists are literally associating with Black people and trying to teach them how to read and educate them and all that kind of stuff. And so this becomes really, really serious. And what happens, what Adventists decide to do is they say, and this is Black and white Adventists at the time in these situations, they say, hey, maybe we should try to do this differently. And so it was primarily white Adventists who were going to say, white Adventists, you take care of your own. Black Adventists, you take care of your own. And so this ideology starts to kind of develop in the 1890s. It's really around the turn of the century, really around 1900. And Ellen White herself is going to make that shift, but she makes it very clear that it's a stopgap measure. She says that for the time being, until God shows us a better way, we need to do this. And so we will be doing that kind of in practice for a few decades until finally in the middle of World War II, through the death of Lucy Bayard, Adventists will create regional conferences. And so it becomes a structural, very clear, definable thing that still exists to this day. And here's the problem. Our pioneers were saying, look, at this time, the violence is so vast, it's so real, that for right now, we probably shouldn't do it this way. And by doing it the way they did empower Black Adventists. Black Adventists had control over their conferences, over control of their finances, and white Adventists were pilfering their finances from them. Ellen White speaks up very strongly against this because they're raising money for the Southern work, and then it gets diverted to white missions elsewhere instead of going to the colored people in the South. And so Ellen White is incredibly vehement on this injustice. But whenever we created the Black conferences, et cetera, we did empower Black people. And that was good to a degree. The problem is, as I see it, is that we have continued. We are no longer in the 1940s, 1900, whatever. The level of racism, we still have major problems with racism, but it isn't that bad. If we were to desegregate, like to get rid of our regional conferences now, no white Americans are probably going to kill us, if we did that. But nevertheless, what happens is that people started to, white Adventists started to use Ellen White and ignore the provisionary statements that she makes and basically say, this is ordained from God that we have separate conferences. And we've built up an ideology, and white Adventists have continually been the problem. Black Adventists, when in the 1940s, they did not want there to be separate conferences. They wanted to be integrated, and as Ben Baker has pointed out, it's partially because whites had better facilities, better drinking fountains, better bathrooms, better whatever, nicer churches, etc. There's that. but also they just wanted to not have this segregated stuff. And so they were not for it. And so it was a white Adventist, primary white Adventist invention. And Adventists by that time had become convinced that this was sort of God's plan, and they were ignoring the provisionary clauses that Ellen White was very clear. And that Ellen White was not speaking as a prophet. She was speaking to Jim Crow. Okay. And so we need to change that, I think. I would like to see the regional conferences go. But you know what? It's going to be white Adventists that have really got to show that they're willing to make that happen in a good way. How is it going to go down if it goes down? Who's conference president, treasurer, secretary, officers, or whatever, executive committee of the new conference? White person, black person, mixed? What is it? What's it going to be? What are we going to do? If we integrate our conferences, are white people going to get more power and tell black people that they can't worship certain ways in their churches, that they can't have a certain style of music or whatever? Are they going to do that? And so there are tons of practical questions, and we have got to get to the point and realize that when we critique like Black Adventist worship, for example, that is simply a mask for our racism. We claim, it's not that I don't like black music. It's just that, it's too loud, or I don't think drums should be in the church. And it's like, hold the phone. Hold the phone. Is that really, really your concern? Or are you simply using that as an excuse, as a mask to hide the true fact that you don't want to associate that closely or have them have any kind of a say over how worship should be done in your local congregation? And so the real barrier, folks, as I see it, to why we have these regional conferences still is because white Adventists have never demonstrated their willingness to have them go away. We've got to demonstrate that we are willing to truly treat our black brothers and sisters and other racial minorities as our equals. And that's my perspective on that issue. But it's a good question. Hopefully that sort of got to it, Lucian.
Yeah, okay, to follow up on this, maybe as a historian, maybe you can draw from examples of, history. It's that we can't have, I think we can talk about separation of our church conferences, but there has to be some kind of a reconciliation, right?
Yeah. Yes.
Is the church, in your opinion, and, given the historical facts, is the church ever going to, or has the church ever been a leader on that front to be able to lead in some of this racial reconciliation? Because unless we're able to do that, it doesn't matter what we call them, whether state conferences, not regional conferences, what have you. If that underlying factor hasn't been healed, then it's of no good, whatever we do after that.
Yep. That's a great question. And I'm going to be frank with you. One of the critiques that you could throw at our pioneers, I'm going to give it to you. In the North, before the Civil War, like in 1860, only about 1% of the Northern population was black. Only about 1%. Through the research of Benjamin Baker and myself, we think that probably at least 3% of Adventists before the Civil War were black. So we were drawing in a larger percentage. However, that's a small number. Black Adventists were scattered hither and yon. And you have to ask the question, and we can't prove it one way or the other. If the North had been overrun with black people, would the white pioneers have been as radical as they were? Because historians have pointed out that there seems to be a magical tipping point around the 10% mark. And if you get to about 10%, and only about 90% of the group is now white and about 10% is black, you start to see a lot more racism come out. And we never reached that. And so you probably can't say that Adventists, even in the pioneer period, even though they stood out and did amazing things, we can't prove definitively one way or the other how they would have reacted. But where we are really tested with race is whenever we started to have a lot more black Adventists. And that's when we started to fail. And I have never seen Adventists as leaders on this issue or question, except in the pioneer period. But there again, they weren't being tested as thoroughly as we probably would have liked. But yeah, I don't see Adventists being the leader on that. I wish we could become so, is my dream and hope, because racism is a sin in every form. We are all journeying, as Ellen White says, to the same heaven. We are forming the characters on this earth to prepare us for heaven. If we are harboring any sort of racist bigotry, any kind of bigotry of any kind in our hearts, we are not prepared. We are simply not prepared. And so we have to get rid of that, and we have to fight against it now. And I would love to see Adventists. We are the most racially diverse religion in America. That a lot of white Adventists like to hold that up and say, look how awesome we are. And it's just like, guys, this is tokenism, okay? That's just a token. People would be so elated if we elected a black GC president, and we actually did. I think it was in the 1990s, and he declined to serve. But people would be so excited if we had a black GC president, and it would be great. But the problem is that is what you could easily call tokenism. What we really need to do is change it on the ground level to where in every local congregation, we don't have issues of racism in our churches. That's when we know we are victorious. It doesn't matter if we have a black General Conference president, although that would be nice. And it would be a great statement to make. But if we hold that up as a great thing without having truly gained a victory, it's just deceptive.
Yeah. Does anyone have any questions? I think Kevin's presentation has been very insightful